Welcome everybody to another episode of JewishDrink.com, the show. Today we have on to discuss a really interesting topic that I'm pretty sure most people have never thought about, which is 18th and 19th century tavern keepers in Poland, most of whom were Jewish. And to discuss this, we have Professor Glenn Diner, who is currently the chair of the religion department at Sarah Lawrence College. And he, in addition to getting his BA from Brandeis, his MA from McGill, and PhD back at Brandeis University, he's got a couple of books out. He's got Men of Silk, the Hasidic Conquest of Polish Jewish Society. But more pertinently for our conversation, he also came out with a really interesting book, which people here might want to pick up, called Yankel's Tavern, Jews, Liquor, and Life in the Kingdom of Poland. And I first heard of him several years ago when I heard him give a talk in Long Beach in March 2015 about Jews, Liquor, and Life in the Kingdom. Once I started this podcast, I knew I had to get him on to talk about this because how many people out there know about it? And one other thing, I just want to promote this, in addition to promoting the Yankel's Tavern book, is that Professor Diner here was recently awarded the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation grant to write a new book coming out, and that book's about what?
The book I'm writing now currently is about Hasidism in Poland between the wars and during the Holocaust, with not as much alcohol in it.
Not as much alcohol. But if people are interested in your 2013 book with alcohol in it, that's still out there, right?
Very much so.
Very much so. And by the way, the image that I've got behind me, that's on the cover of your 2013 book, right?
Yes,
Yeah, so what is this picture, by the way?
Oh, so that's actually a lithograph that was done as part of a series of daily life scenes in Poland by Gustav Pilaty in the 1870s. So it's fascinating that along with about 12 or 13 other scenes of daily life, we have the Jewish-run tavern, and it's a really interesting illustration of the kinds of day-to-day interactions that occurred and coexistence that occurred in pre-emancipation Kingdom of Poland that really, I think, challenges our conception of a purely dark and anti-Semitic culture that persecuted Jews relentlessly. I think this shows that there were times where the system basically worked. It was relatively stable and relatively prosperous. And it's all thanks to vodka.
Wow. And then this guy right here that I'm mostly covering up, right? He's the tavern keeper here in this picture?
Yeah, and he took liberties. You know, he has him wearing a tallis, and there's a loaf of challah on the bar, which probably is not very true to the reality. But these are of course, kind of iconographic images that really communicate to the viewer that this is a type, right? This is the Jewish tavern keeper, lest you had any doubts. And then we have the peasants dressed in their festive garb, and it's probably a religious holiday. And there's even a Jewish musician who's playing the violin while the peasants are dancing. So it's semi-fictionalized in order to kind of, I would say, project the symbolism of the time period and the culture.
How did you come upon doing this, the research and the writing for this topic?
Well, as part of my first book, which was an attempt to contextualize the Hasidic movement as it arose in the Kingdom of Poland, I kept coming across words like vodka, tavern keeper, and it was always alongside the word Jew. And I started to get curious. I'd seen that image for sure in Polish literature. And you may have heard of certain Yiddish songs and Hasidic tales that mention drinking and mention tavern keeping. And usually it's the Gentile who's drunk and the Jew who's serving the liquor. But I hadn't really put it all together until this book, where I realized this was kind of a window into the entire society, especially a window onto Jewish and Christian day-to-day coexistence.
Was it predominantly Hasidic, or it was across Polish Jewry and just Hasidim were a part of that?
It very much preceded the Hasidic movement, but it also kind of reached its peak during the rise of Hasidism. So, scholars disagree as to what proportion of the society, what Polish Jewish society was Hasidic at this point. But the general sense is the Hasidic movement was extremely popular by the first couple of decades of the 19th century. And so Hasidism is arising in a society in which the economy and, of course, the society itself is very much reliant upon Jewish participation in the liquor trade, especially as suppliers, producers of the liquor, and sellers of the liquor to the surrounding peasantry, which was usually done on monopolistic terms, to really the ultimate benefit of the nobility, who owned the vast majority of land.
How much were the Polish Jews involved in the consumption of vodka? My totally separate down the road question is in the production and purveying of the liquor, of the vodka.
Yeah, so the general image is definitely of Jewish sobriety. And that's one that went by the wayside as I actually did my research, especially since, as a historian of Hasidism, I couldn't believe that this image of Jewish sobriety could survive the rise of a movement that not only tolerated liquor consumption at levels not seen before in Jewish history, but actually, in many ways, sanctioned it and made it part of ritual. So, alongside this flourishing Jewish liquor trade, we have the rise of a movement, Hasidism, which very much participates in the consumption of alcohol. And yet these images of Jewish sobriety seemed to survive.
I have at least 3 different questions. So my first question is how do you think it survived this notion of Jewish sobriety? But totally separately, you mentioned the ritual aspects of vodka for Hasidism. So I have 2 further questions. One is, how was it involved? How was it ritualized? And totally separately, but maybe connected, is also, would you say that vodka helped fuel the Hasidic movement?
In a certain sense, it did help fuel the Hasidic movement, because here was a movement that expanded the boundaries of holiness onto daily life and onto the mundane sphere, which included the consumption of vodka. Now, Jews really did drink. They just seemed to drink less. There weren't problems with what today we call alcoholism on the level that really seemed to pervade Polish Catholic society. And the reason we know this is, number one, the rabbis don't mention drunkenness in their sermons as a problem the way the priests do in their sermons. And I compared these sermons in my book.
Oh, wow.
But also there weren't temperance societies that arose in Jewish society the way they did in non-Jewish society. So these are all indications that the sobriety myth was not a complete myth, that the sobriety myth had an element of truth to it. But the difference was, when Hasidic Jews and other Jews drank, it tended to be in strictly Jewish or Hasidic spaces, at the Rebbe's court, in the Hasidic shtibel or prayer house. It wasn't really in the view of the dominant surrounding culture as much. And it tended to be more regimented. There were times when it was appropriate to make what was called a tikkun at the time, a cosmic repair by means of taking a shot. In our language, we would call this a toast, but this was a toast with deep religious significance. And you would make a toast for various reasons, to celebrate the anniversary or Jewish holiday, or the yahrzeit of a deceased tzaddik or Jewish holy man, and so on. You'd find different excuses to make that kind of a toast. But as controlled as it was, there was still a lot of drinking going on. The difference is, in the tavern, it's predominantly a Jewish tavern keeper who's keeping his wits about him because he's got a business to run. And for the peasantry, and to some extent the nobility, this is their leisure space. This is their leisure activity. So the myths start to arise of the drunken Gentile and the sober Jew, and the myth actually comes from both sides, from both societies. The difference being that when non-Jews would propagate an image of the sober Jewish tavern keeper, they didn't mean it as a compliment. They meant it as an accusation that here was this Jew remaining suspiciously sober so that he could further exploit the hapless peasant, drive him into debt, and take advantage. Jews had their own counter myth of the drunken and profligate Goy or Gentile. That could be a peasant, but it could also be a nobleman who simply lacked self-control, and the image has all kinds of bestial properties to it. An attempt by an embattled minority to try to feel like they're a little bit culturally superior. And that's what I argue in my book. I go through a lot of these myths. They're on both sides very harsh. They're not sympathetic. And yet we have to remember also, it's not pure xenophobia that's driving these myths. There's also a reason for them, because Jews and Gentiles, especially in these taverns, are in very close quarters, and you need to propagate a negative image of the other in order to maintain boundaries. Otherwise, you have a lot of people, the wrong people, falling in love, converting to each other's religions, and religious leaders on both sides did not want that to happen. So I think a lot of these negative myths really were ways of regulating differences and divisions, boundaries between these two cultures who were living in such close proximity. And by the way, transgressions did occur.
Yeah.
People did fall in love, people did convert, and it didn't always work.
Yeah. How did this get started? What was the etiology of the Jews becoming tavern keepers? How'd that all start? Someone had to have an idea.
Yeah, well, so what tended to happen was the entire economy for a long time in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is what Poland was in the early modern period until it was partitioned, the main economy was grain. They were the breadbasket of Europe. They would export their grain throughout Europe, and the nobility would get quite wealthy as a result. And any excess or surplus grain they would turn into vodka. This was mainly rye that grew virtually anywhere. They would turn it into vodka and sell it to their serfs on monopolistic terms in their taverns. And they didn't feel that they could really trust peasants to run these taverns, especially in the countryside. And that's where Jews came in. And Jews were very keen to cultivate this image of sobriety and business acumen. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The sober Jew who's an entrepreneur, who's good with basic arithmetic, can run a tavern responsibly, and they make themselves indispensable, which is always the key to Jewish survival anywhere, is finding that economic niche. Now, as Poland gets partitioned in stages at the end of the 18th century, suddenly you have borders that are created, and with borders come tariffs, and it really hurts the grain export trade. So what do the nobility do with all that grain that it can no longer export? It turns it into more and more vodka to sell more and more of it to its peasants. And this intoxicating and addictive substance is being sold to them by Jews, the quintessential outgroup. It doesn't do much for Jewish-Christian relations, but they're virtually protected, the Jews are, by noble business interests. They really feel that only Jews can run their taverns successfully.
You're saying the rise of the taverns, and specifically with this rye-based vodka, came about because of the tariffs. What was before that vodka, or before those taverns were using that rye-based vodka?
Jews were always involved in the taverns and the liquor trade as soon as they arrived in the Middle Ages, but it was only sort of around the edges of this very robust grain export trade. As the grain export trade gets curtailed during the partitions, it simply increases the reliance of the nobility on the liquor trade and on their Jewish tavern keepers and distillers. That's why it becomes both so profitable and so much more dangerous for Jews, because with success comes jealousy, resentment, and the fact that they're selling a highly addictive and dangerous substance only adds to the tension.
What ends up happening with all this? Because I know that I remember when you spoke in Long Beach several years ago that at some point they wanted to try to not use Jews as tavern keepers, and that didn't work out so well, right?
So the story of the 19th century really is this attempt by what are now absolutist monarchs to drive Jews out of the liquor trade. And as an absolute monarch, they have absolute power, except that they don't really, because they're working against the interests of the local economy, which is still in the hands of the nobility. So you have a situation arise where Jews are expelled en masse from various places and then sort of allowed to come back in. And that's why when you used to read studies of Jews in the liquor trade, it was very confusing, because the Jews would be expelled en masse, and then 10 years later they'd be expelled en masse again from the taverns and from the countryside, and they keep getting re-expelled. So it's a story that doesn't really make sense until you realize that the nobles are working at cross purposes with the monarchs and with the state. So it's more of a triangular relationship now between the state, the local nobility, and the Jews. And usually in these cases, the local economy wins out, because you can't be everywhere at once if you're the state. And often you really get the sense that they're nowhere anytime, because this vast underground liquor trade arises in which Jews are still running the vast majority of the taverns. They're producing the vast majority of the liquor. They're simply installing a Christian front. And that's for the sake of the state inspectors. Which is interesting.
It becomes a game, and everybody's in on the game.
Right. Well, not everybody, because the state officials seem genuinely shocked when they discover that everything that had happened a century ago is still going on, really full throttle. And what that says to me, which is so interesting about all of this, is there's tremendous collusion going on at the local level between Jews and Christians. The peasants, the nobles, and anytime there's a state investigation, they cover for the local Jewish tavern keeper, which shows that there was a lot of goodwill. And one of the most interesting moments is when I found a town very close to the town of Jedwabne, which is infamous for its neighbors turning on the Jews, Christian neighbors turning on the Jews in the midst of the Holocaust and slaughtering 1,600 of their Jewish neighbors in a town in which a century earlier, which is the archival sources that I work with, they were actually covering for the Jews and keeping them from being expelled from the taverns and from the town, from the village. And it shows you how much changed with emancipation.
How was this vodka produced? You said it was with this rye, and and I'm also going to ask you, what was the availability of other alcohol sources? Wine, beer, anything else? Why was it vodka?
Well, in the case of wine, you really had to import it, usually from Hungary. And that was more expensive. You know, it's mainly nobility that can afford this. You can make raisin wine, you can make other kinds of wine, and certainly around Passover, you have to make other kinds of alcoholic beverages, the most famous one being Slivovitz, plum brandy. So there are different varieties available, and for the nobles, the Jewish tavern keepers would make a special kind of vodka that had different kind of seasonings in it and so on. But the day-to-day most economical, cheapest, and strongest substance was rye-based vodka. There was a period of time when they experimented with the potato, because you could make a lot more vodka on the same plot of land using potatoes, but it was just at the time. This seems to be a very typical Polish story in the history of the country. As soon as they introduced the potato blight occurred. It wasn't just Ireland that suffered from the potato famine. And so all these crops were destroyed and everyone went back to using rye to make vodka.
If I remember your talk several years ago correctly, it wasn't the clear vodka that we think of today, right?
No, it was very harsh, and made as cheaply as possible. So it's not as processed by any stretch of the imagination. And the point was really to make it really cheap and really strong. I mean, vodka was the currency. It was called liquid currency. It's what the nobility paid its workers with. It's the way that Jews could make the most money in the shortest amount of time. And of course, the biggest problem with it was the social cost. Alcohol addiction became a pervasive problem. Peasant drunkenness, what we would call today alcoholism, was a huge problem. And guess who got blamed for the widespread drunkenness? And it was the members of this quintessential outgroup, the Jews, who in many people's minds are still considered in league with the devil. And now they're made responsible for society's most pervasive problem, alcoholism. And that fuels, again, this attempt to drive Jews out of the liquor trade. But what's always saved Jews in prior centuries has been their economic utility, and that was very much the case now as well, is nobles simply couldn't bring themselves. And honestly, the Jewish tavern keeper had a lot of functions beyond just selling liquor. He was a crucial part of the local peasant social life, even religious celebrations. Every wedding was celebrated in the tavern.
Oh, wow.
Even funerals were commemorated there. You'd start out in the church and you'd migrate en masse to the tavern, where you were met by the very priest-like tavern keeper, sort of the anti-priest, who would make a toast to the newlywed couple or in honor of the deceased. And then the music would start up and everyone would sing, dance, and drink. It was very much part of the local fabric. And so it's hard to displace this crucial figure, the Jewish tavern keeper. People could barely imagine having anyone else in that role, and they helped each other out. Jews could do things for Christians as part of their religious celebrations that it would have been inconvenient for them to do, not to mention the advice, the money lending, offering credit when necessary, medical remedies, mediating with the nobility. They served all these diverse functions in local life. So displacing the tavern keeper, the Jewish tavern keeper, would have really been disruptive. And by the same token, the Jewish tavern keeper relied very heavily on the surrounding Christian population, not just as customers, but as somebody to run the tavern on Shabbat and on festivals when you're not supposed to be running a tavern anyways. So they would use the surrounding population as the Sabbath goy, as it was called, a Christian who could perform the same functions, and their rabbinical contracts that were drawn up to make sure that this was done in a kosher, proper manner. And when it became illegal for Jews to run taverns, these same Christians could serve the purpose as a front for the tavern. And I just continue to be amazed at the degree of local cooperation and coexistence in order to keep this whole system going. Where it begins to fall apart is the unintended consequences of peasant emancipation, which happens in the 1860s. So suddenly, all these peasants are unleashed on the economy.
Yeah.
They want to open their own taverns and run their own taverns. The nobility, many are impoverished at this point, partly as a result of emancipation, partly as a result of just mismanagement and the availability of other sources of grain from America and from the interior of Russia, better ways of transporting grain, the steamship, the railroad. The nobility is in large part ruined, and they too are brought into competition with the Jewish tavern keepers. And now you start to see stress on the system where they're turning in the Jewish tavern keepers, or they're opening up a tavern right next door to the Jewish run tavern. And the way I saw this whole process unfolding up close 10 years after emancipation was a whole trove of petitions to a miracle worker, a Jewish non-Hasidic miracle worker named Eliyahu Gutmacher. And these petitions, many of them are by tavern keepers complaining about the new competition.
Then from the 1860s, 1870s, so then what ends up happening to the decline of, is it ultimately the Holocaust which ends it? Is it World War I? Like what ends up happening to the downfall of the Jewish tavern keepers?
Well, with economic competition comes economic-based anti-Semitism. It's no coincidence, in my opinion, that this is also the period soon of the pogroms and other forms of anti-Jewish violence and other manifestations of anti-Semitism. Because the one thing that had really been kind of holding everybody together, the Jewish-run tavern, is now no longer fulfilling its function. And that's when things become very dangerous for Jews, and it creates instability throughout the entire society. It's now much more of a free market economy, and the nobility actually loses its monopoly on the liquor trade at the end of the 19th century. You have at the same time the rise of political anti-Semitism, newspapers and political parties that are proudly anti-Semitic, and they really want to remove Jews not just from tavern keeping, but from what they see as their privileged position in the economy in general. And Jews really are very predominant in trade and to a lesser extent crafts, and they're very prominent in the cities. And this is what really fuels the kind of anti-Semitism leading all the way down to the Holocaust, which we have to remember was actually perpetrated by Germans, not by Poles, right? So Germans invade, but there's plenty of ill will and hostility within Poland that makes it very difficult for Poles to help and to rescue Jews, even if they wanted to. That's how the system really comes to a close. It's very hard to detect the decline of Jews in the liquor trade because even in the 1920s and 30s, when supposedly Jews didn't run taverns anymore, they did. Because Jews are always very good at doing what has to be done to survive economically. And if you're a minority group that's discriminated against the way Jews were, being law-abiding is basically impossible if you want to survive. So I'm sure that the liquor trade, the Jewish involvement in the liquor trade survives all the way down to the Holocaust, which is why genealogists who looked into their roots and research what their grandparents and great-grandparents did before the Holocaust are always finding, and they're coming to me and telling me that their grandparents ran taverns in the old country, and historians used to tell them, no, that's impossible, because Jews were expelled from the liquor trade completely, depending on what year you want to give, because it's all in the archives, in the official records. Jews no longer run taverns and distilleries. What I found, though, when I dug deeper, is that the genealogists were correct, that what their grandparents told them was actually true. They really did run taverns, just unofficially. And this is why it survives in Polish literature as well as such a central trope. And the iconic Jewish tavern keeper remains all the way down until the destruction of the Jewish community in the Holocaust.
I know this is a little bit more of an academic question, but for scholars listening, viewing this out there, do you have things that you came across that you think would be great avenues for future scholarship related to this, whether it's pre the 18th, 19th century beforehand, like maybe researching before, I don't know if there are other, who knows, or maybe just geographically separate but chronologically similar questions.
One thing we still do not know is the role of Jews in the liquor trade in Poland in the 20th century. My book really stops at the end of the 19th century with a little bit of an epilogue. So an avenue for future research would definitely be to look and see to what extent that underground Jewish liquor trade persists down to the Holocaust.
15th, 16th, 17th century Poland. Has that been researched much?
So I would say there is much more on the pre-18th century, on the so-called early modern period. That's been very well researched by two excellent historians. Actually, I'll say three excellent historians in particular: Moshe Rossman, Adam Teller, and Judith Kalik, or Judith Kalik.
Wow.
So that's been very well researched. But the 19th century had been by and large neglected, and I think the 20th century as well.
So in addition to people wanting to go out and buying your 2013 Yankel's Tavern book, of course, totally about this topic, and if you're watching this, you may be interested in buying that book. But in addition to that, so Professor Diner here has this Guggenheim grant, and so yeah, what's this current project you're working on?
Thanks. My current project is really about Polish Jewish life between the two world wars and during the Holocaust, that reassesses the supposed decline of tradition and the extensive secularization of Jewish society with the rise of Zionism and socialism. Now, these things really did happen, but I found that the Hasidic movement and other modes of Jewish traditionalism and orthodoxy were much more influential and powerful than had been previously realized. So just as in my last book, I talked about, well, I found sources on the continued vitality of the Jewish liquor trade at a time when it was supposed to have declined. I'm finding now the continued vitality of the Hasidic movement and orthodoxy in general in Poland at a time when historians virtually write it off as something in steep decline. And the sources, once again, are absolutely priceless. I've come across numerous archives, which for some reason historians had said didn't exist anymore, that really record the Hasidic power and influence throughout the countryside and even in larger towns and cities. I found interviews with rabbis where they talk about the Polish Jewish condition and their views on Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, and immigration there. And what's emerging is a Hasidic population that is actually revitalizing, regenerating in the wake of World War I by redefining themselves as educational entrepreneurs. You have the emergence, what I'm finding is you have the emergence of the Hasidic yeshiva and the learned Hasidic society as a key to the continued or rejuvenation of Hasidic society, alongside political movements like Agudat Yisrael, youth movements, female education through the Beis Yaakov school system, all these ways that the Hasidic community is reinventing itself in order to survive into the 20th century. And of course, what's so tragic about it is that it all gets cut off brutally by the Holocaust. But the most inspiring thing I'm finding is that Hasidism really succeeds not only because of its inspirational message and its music and its revitalized educational system, but it also succeeds because it is such a powerful mode of resistance against assimilation or Polonization in a society that really doesn't accept Jews fully anyways. And during the Holocaust, it becomes a powerful mode of resistance, spiritual resistance as well.
When do you think that'll come out? 2021?
Let's not try to predict.
Okay.
But let's just say I'm making a lot of progress.
Okay, that's good to hear. Awesome. All right. Well, Professor Diner, thank you so much for coming on, spending time with us today. And thank you so much, and L'chaim.
L'chaim, thank you very much. Enjoyed this a lot.